tuning in to this episode of the iDeas podcast. With me is the person who kicked it all off in episode 1 of the last series, Phill Lord-David, who is now the head of learning, development and user experience at I Am Learning Content. Phill, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
No, thanks for having me. Seems like ages ago since we did that last one.
It's because it was. My series are very well spaced out, is how I like. I'm going to word it as, I like to give the viewers time to really contemplate what's been said before we launch another episode, as opposed to Tom cannot keep to a publishing schedule on his channel.
We don't overwhelm people, do we?
Well, exactly. That's it. It's a bite-sized podcast in a world of bite-sized learning. There we go. We'll go with that. Except the episodes are massive. They're just well spaced. Last time I think we spoke a little bit about kind of UX and design in the learning and development world. I know we'll touch on some more of that today as well. But before we get into introductions and what we're going to talk about, the real reason everyone tunes in and always has done is to find out what people are drinking during the conversations. So, Phill, what have you got going?
So it's a bit misleading actually because it's in a coffee cup. Because unfortunately the dishwasher was on. I timed that very badly, and it's got my beer glass in it. So This is the only coffee cup I've got that actually feels it can hold the whole lot. So I've currently got a Vocation IPA on the go, but it's in a coffee cup.
Nice. Oh, lovely stuff.
What are you drinking?
Slightly, it's kind of like work appropriate beer. I like it. I was really disappointed. I thought I had some beers left over. I've totally run out. So I'm having a really nice Rambler 74 citric gin and tonic with a elderflower tonic, and it's very nice.
I do like the elderflower.
I must admit.
I like to drink elderflower tonic just by itself. It's quite refreshing.
It is, yeah, but it's quite warm here at the minute, I find, isn't it? So this was a good end of day drink.
End of day. Let's face it, you've had that on the go since 12 o'clock.
Well, not this one, obviously. But,
it'll be very warm.
Absolutely, this is not true. Don't panic. It's been on the go since 1. Anyway, so last time we spoke about UX. This time I know we're going to speak a little bit about kind of L&D as a whole product solution, and I really want to ask you about when you talk about that, what you mean. But first things first, for those who didn't tune in a year and a half ago, as if those people exist, introduce yourself if you want to know who you are.
Yeah, so I'm Phill. As Tom mentioned, I'm head of learning and UX for I Am Learning, so an off-the-shelf content provider for content that basically utilises animation and focuses on application of learning rather than learning theories. I guess my main mission has always been in my career to create better learning experiences for people and get rid of the dull, clicky PowerPoints that are basically a tick box exercise, and then you get this horrendously easy, guessable quiz at the end, which we all know everyone jumps to and passes within seconds, and then just passes the answer on to their mate. So yeah, that's kind of been my key mission, and I guess over probably the last 2 years, really, it's really focused and shifted a little bit into not necessarily just creating great learning experiences, but how do you create an overall great, I guess, product in that experience as well, rather than just being solely a individual solution or experience. But how do you map that out and fit it into the wider world?
Awesome. Yeah, I know obviously we've worked together a lot, and we still work together now. So it's always been a pleasure. Which is why I'm quite interested to hear about this, your take on the whole product solution in terms of L&D, because this is something where we seem to draw a very big line between L&D being, everyone kind of says, we don't want to be order takers anymore. But then they kind of describe, we're a service provider. Well, service providers take orders. That's inherently what that is. It's surely that's one and the same thing. So I'm really interested here when you say starting to think of L&D as a whole product solution. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I agree that there's a bit of a shift in the fact that we need to not be order takers, in the sense of people don't tell us what the right solution is or what they want, but they should be ordering, if you like, a solution to the problems that they have. So yes, there is this kind of shift, but in many ways, unless we become data analyst teams as well, which is certainly not another skill we need to be adding to the ever-growing skill set within our careers, then yeah, we do rely on the business to come to us and say, we've got a problem, can you help us solve it? So when I kind of say this, kind of looking at L&D as an overall product, what I mean by that is when you create a e-learning course, let's say a stakeholder comes to you, they need a specific problem, they need a course or a learning intervention, whatever that might be, to solve X problem. We often have looked at that as that individual solution, which isn't necessarily the wrong thing because you're trying to solve that problem. It's kind of stepping aside and saying, well, if we're putting this additional product out there, which I guess, this course is to a degree a product to your people, how does that fit into everything else that you provide? Don't just dump it into this sea of other stuff that you have available, but how does that potentially change the overall experience and content architecture of maybe your LMS? The ones that spring to mind is refresher training. When somebody wants a refresher, let's say e-learning course is the right solution or resource, whatever it might be, you put that onto your LMS, you roll it out, and then it remains on there. But is that the right thing to do? Should you be looking at the original training and saying, well, actually, is there a piece to be updated there? Should this refresher remain there? Because that could cause confusion. Should people do the refresher course or should they do the original course? And especially with new starters as well. So yeah, that's kind of, I guess, how I'd sum it up, is not thinking about individual solutions, but it's kind of thinking the wider picture. How does that change the overall navigation and experience and overall offering of what you're putting out there?
So in some ways it is kind of similar to kind of taking a slightly more holistic view as opposed to just looking at singular instances of we need to do a thing.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's great to have all of these learning opportunities for people, but there is such thing as too much. And when you've got similar things potentially doing the same job, whether that's a workshop, an e-learning, a resource, they're all doing similar things, but they were built for a slightly different purpose. It does become confusing for people in the business going, well, which one of these should I do? Which is the most effective? And then L&D teams, of course, have the additional task of keeping all three of these up to date should there be some sort of change to process law, legislation, whatever it might be. So in a very time-conscious team, we're almost creating more work for ourselves by not spending that little bit of extra work when we create these individual solutions and saying, how does that fit to everything else? It would kind of be like, I guess, a phone provider or a mobile phone kind of creating a new app or feature or service and just putting that onto the phone and let people run an update on it without thinking, how does that map to everything else on the phone, and how does that potentially change the ordering or how people navigate to that particular piece? So when you kind of compare them in those two worlds, it almost feels a bit bonkers that we've never really done it all the time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because you talk about apps there, and this is almost like a product development mindset. These are the kind of considerations that you hear, a business who is going to launch a new mobile phone, let's say, thinking about where does this phone sit in the existing market? Where does it sit in our current product stack? Which is something we don't often hear about in L&D. We don't think about ourselves as having a product stack, but we do. It's everything we've put out into the business, right? And I guess popular a few years ago, and I know we kind of we used to hear it a lot, was the Netflix of learning thing. And it's interesting how, as I've kind of thought about it more and more over the years, I've gone from thinking, oh, that's innovative and new, to thinking, hang on, the biggest problem with something like Netflix is that we all sit there every night going, there's 500 things on here, which one do I do? And that's kind of exactly what you're describing there in terms of users looking at content and thinking, well, which one's for me, right?
Exactly, yeah. And
it's
I guess the other layer to when you start adding to that is people are screaming out, and we know that people want lots of learning opportunities. And when you've got people in your business that have a real variety of learning needs, whether that's capability and skill related, or whether that's just additional learning opportunities, things like mental health training and all the social platforms and stuff like that you start adding in, it does become a lot. Companies go, yeah, we've got like 500,000 learning opportunities for you, but they've never spent the time on their LMS to say, well, how does that order together? How does it all hang together as an overall product and an overall solution for these people? And you could argue that, yeah, we've kind of done it sometimes where we get learning paths or people create catalogues, but they're not always the right thing to do. It'd be like creating, online shopping is a prime example of the closest correlation, I think, to an LMS, where there is a degree of complexity when you've got so much offering that you cannot avoid when you create this product. So, because if you've got 1,000 courses, 500, whatever it might be, organising that in a way that people can actually access it, and not the way that you think they would access it, but the way that they actually try and access it, it's getting down to that crux, and how does that all hang together? Should it be a learning plan? Should it be a catalogue? Should it be open? How much tagging is too much tagging? Great features in LMSs and LXPs where you can tag learning, but if you start tagging every single learning with coaching, communication, and before you know it, you've got 10 or 12 tags, when you try and search that tag, you basically just go from like 500 to 450 courses, so your tagging is actually useless. So this is where I think if we start looking more into that product management, product development side of things, and using those models that they use, it was a concept, I think, probably 3 years ago that was really talked about loads, about getting learners involved in learning design. And that was kind of touching on this similar point where get in their heads, get to their understanding, get them involved in the actual creation of the process. It's not to say that they're right or wrong, or that you have to do what they say, but the insight locked into people's heads about how they would use that platform or navigate it is gold mine, really. Because just because we think, like, if I'm creating an LMS, for example, how I would order and structure it is probably very different to potentially how you might think to order and structure it. And you might think that you know your business and people really well, but why wouldn't you just spend the time actually asking them and getting them involved in that? So I think this is where things like user profiling, card sorting, and asking people to complete those tasks that you're going to do yourselves and find the patterns and trends in those. If you've got 20 or 30 people all categorising the stuff the same way from different areas of the business, then you know that's going to work because that is from the horse's mouth. But if you find that that doesn't correlate to how you were going to build it, then don't build it in the way that you were going to build it. Listen to those people. Because if they can't find it, you've actually got no content at all. You've just got a load of stuff sat behind on a server.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? That it's the kind of thing you don't see a lot in L&D, and yet I can't think of another industry that would launch a platform without that. You see all these companies who have levels of focus groups and market research going on, and they have the challenge of being an external force, as it were. Everyone who steps into a market research session for Microsoft or whatever knows that they're there to help Microsoft sell something to them eventually. Whereas as an L&D department or a learning provider, you have a somewhat captive audience there, who probably actively want to have input were they given the opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, it's a gold mine of insight that you get from your people. And it's funny you say that, because no other tech provider outside of L&D would ever launch without running some sort of testing or user insight, or speaking to the people that they're delivering a problem this to. Because yes, your overall problem is you need to deliver learning solutions to your people, whether that's face-to-face or digital, remote, whatever it might be. But we start thinking too much about that individual solution and how do we improve X skill, rather than thinking how does that then get accessed and how do people then know how to go and do that. And this is where you get things like your campaigns, your blended learnings, and your comms teams all coming together. So it's not to say that all of this needs to sit just on L&D's shoulders, that you can start looking to other departments that can help you with this stuff, to run these sort of workshops and these exercises. And it's a great opportunity if you're bringing in digital from scratch. If you're bringing in a new LMS and new content, that you're in a great position. If I can recommend anything that you do in that space, is don't rush trying to get it out there and actually listen to people and how you want to get it out to the business and launch it. Is that with just initially 10 or 20 courses that are imperative right now and you build on that? Is it you throw 500 courses at people and expect them to know how to find it? Do you build it all yourself? You spend all of this time up front, build the platform that people need and that works for them and not deliver it to them, then that's where you've got a great opportunity to people actually be able to use these platforms. And then again, if you would never think about even I used to go back to the app solution, you wouldn't think about how that just works as an individual app. You think about the platform it sits on and the technology and what else it integrates with. To do that same exercise with the other technology you've got out there as well. I know we've been in companies, Tom, where we've seen it where you've got a social platform that's in one place, you've got a learning management in another place, then you've got a historical learning management system, or like a centralized one, and then you've got a comms team and a comms platform, and it's like, whoa, where are they going to go for all of this stuff? It's no wonder they don't know where to go and how to access it. And that's not to say that everything needs to be in one place, but it's how does this all flow?
But it does all need to, it needs to link up, right?
Exactly.
Otherwise, after you end up in that situation, but then 10 minutes later, everyone's going, why is no one engaged? Why is engagement so low? Why can no one find the content?
Yeah, why has nobody done
as if it's
this?
some kind of mystery.
Yeah, why has nobody done this compliance course that we've sent 500 emails about? Well, it's probably because they can't find it, or the other argument that it's no good, not very good learning. But I can guarantee, we've seen those scenarios. I've sat by people and they've searched the course name, and unless they search for the specific course name, they can't find it. Or there's been a legacy one left on there because we've never thought to delete it, for example. And then they're going, well, which one do I complete? And then they send a reminder email, and you go, but I have done it. No, you've done the old one from 2 years ago. You should have done this one. It's like, well, yeah, what a rubbish experience. From an L&D point of view, that kills everything that we do, because you can have the most engaging content out there, but if you don't have a great experience in getting to it and completing it and all the other stuff that wraps around that, then really you don't have any engagement at all.
It's interesting. A long time ago, I did a talk with TLDC, and I said everything you design will be experienced through the lens of the LMS. So it doesn't actually matter how good your content is. If the platform on which it sits is a terrible experience to access or use or find content in, then the value of your content is diminished regardless of your effort. And actually now I feel like it goes beyond just the LMS. So you're saying it's the total kind of employee engagement experience. And it's not just engagement, but I'll use that term kind of colloquially. The overall employee experience, I guess even beyond that, really plays a bigger role than I think we've ever given it credit for. Or certainly in most organisations that I've experienced working with anyway. So I'd be interested to hear kind of how do you go about linking those things together in a meaningful way? Because I know everyone always likes to say, we're gonna work collaboratively in an agile way that's product design focused. Other buzzwords. But what does, how complicated actually is it to get all those things working together?
So for me, the first point would be journey mapping. We do it loads in kind of customer experience reviews, don't we? You see these big old customer journey maps that get created in this beast of a software that covers every single variable of that journey. So I'm not necessarily saying to that extent that you need to create it. But creates basic statements that your end users are going to need to do. So things like, I need to be able to access a compliance course after being told to do so. I want to access a learning course on whatever it might be. And you create all these kind of user statements or user goals that they're trying to achieve. And what you do is using whatever existing platform you've got, this is assuming that you've got something existing, map out that process. What are those each steps that you have to go through to find or complete that end goal? It's basically, I think it's called Hick's law. Basically, the time to make a decision increases with the level of complexity or number of choices. So if you are spending too much time as an end user trying to achieve your goal, then you're going to give up at a certain point. And this leads on into the next point after the journey mapping. But if you find in that insight, in that map, that you've got 4 clicks, let's say, just to access the course, which you often see, you click on the thumbnail, then you're into the course, then you click launch course, and then it will take you to another page that says, would you want to launch the course or add the resources? And then you click that again, and then you'll get maybe the player that says play in the course finally starts. That's the sort of thing where could that be made smoother? Now, you're at the disposal of course, the platforms and technology that you're using. There's only so much of that friction you can reduce. But you could then also look at maybe your content content structure and architecture and say, well, actually, could it be put somewhere else that could avoid some of that stuff? So that journey mapping gives you a great insight. It's basically putting it out on the table, and then next to each of those steps, just put what are the insights from that individual step. So there's a lot of clicks here, or it was really hard to find if I didn't search that specific name, or I couldn't find it at all. And then next to that insight, you go, well, where's the opportunity to improve that? And that's where it kind of starts saying, well, there you go. By being the end user, or even getting end users to do this stuff, you've already got some opportunities to improve that overall experience for them. So that's one thing that you can do. And then that kind of leads...
And that's just before you move on to another thing, I thought that was really interesting, because that's very similar to kind of the approach to bringing in a new piece of software to a business, right? You bring it in, you put in like a test or a pilot group, and then you put together kind of test cases. Granted, they're usually very long and complex. We don't want to make it more difficult than it needs to be. But from a kind of selling it to a business perspective, they would never bring in a new internal CRM system or a new billing system or a new website without going through all that testing, would they? So I guess in terms of selling the time and effort to a business, that's the kind of comparable.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. And the same thing could be done as well if you've got an existing platforms already done. You do those same user statements and get either people to do that for you and actually kind of observe those and note down what kind of insight that gives you. You might find that one person is clicking around and they just physically can't find it, or they've gone around the houses. And then you can interview those people as well off the back of that and say, why did you go to X place rather than this particular place? And it gives you that insight into what's in people's actual head and how they're actually transactioning an end goal, rather than the perceived happy path of what you think they're going to do. And yes, to a degree, we spoke about in podcast 1 about kind of the specifics of how you can use user experience and UI to improve all of that stuff. That will help and enable stuff, but it's not the be-all and end-all. Sometimes the most beautiful visual design can actually be the most non-functional, because it doesn't work for the end user. You've built it around what you think rather than what they need. So yeah, absolutely, they're great tools to be going down. Even surveys as well. Send out surveys. Basically find a way of how do you get that insight. I guess it's very similar really to a training needs analysis. How do you get insight where there isn't an insight? How do you turn something into data where there is no data? And it's through surveys and interviews and getting them to transaction these particular goals to gain that insight, and where are the patterns and where are the trends. And there's your opportunities to improve that experience and say, well, how do we adapt our LMS or our platforms to be working better together? So yeah, it's a really powerful tool. And then what you can start doing is you can then start moving on to, how do I explain it? I guess A/B testing is probably the easiest way to explain it. So Once you've got that insight and you've made a solution, don't just assume it works. Put it out there with focus groups, 20, 30 or so people. Give them this solution, give them that solution, and you run those same user goals. Which ones do they find easier? And then it's from those two different options you can say, well, let's get the best of both worlds. I think that's probably something we definitely don't do enough, and probably even in individual learning solutions as well, actually. Business is often very quick to say we need a solution to be out there, but we don't always create a solution, test it. What do we learn from that? Was it effective? And how do we need to change that solution before we roll it out to the entire business? So it's a similar thing with your own, especially with the bigger solutions like bringing in an LMS or new technology. Test it out first. What do you learn from it? Make the changes and then bring it on. And that's how you be an agile business, an agile company, an agile L&D department. You hear agile thrown around a lot. Just because you run over there and then run over this way when somebody says so, that's not agile. That's just bad working ethics, I guess. That's where agile is solving those problems as they come up and not having a set plan and then delivering it, but gaining the insight and solving the problems as you go.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we've kind of, as an industry, we've kind of spoken about things like A/B testing for a long time, but I think quite often there's the argument of you can't do that in the real world, as it were, because the business wants the solution launched now. And I kind of know what my kind of stance on that is, that sometimes that's the reality of the situation, and sometimes that's the current reality because you haven't actually been brave enough to raise your hand and say, there's an issue here and we need to fix it and this is why. Or your team is not viewed as being skilled. I think that kind of goes back to if the business doesn't see you as a valued part of the business, it could be the business's fault, it could also be your fault. It's the cold hard truth, right?
There's nothing wrong with putting a solution out there when it's unfinished. It's just about then going backwards and saying, well, okay, we've got a solution out there, we've put it out, we needed one now. Okay, we need to react. There's a time to react and just deal with the solution, whether that's an individual learning solution or whether that is technology and new platforms and bigger strategic stuff that you have to rush through here and now. But then go back and spend the time to do that stuff still, I think. Don't just launch it and then let it kind of trickle along and think, great, we've done it, now let people figure out, and we'll try and make this Frankenstein of a thing going forward and try and improve these bits and do all this patchwork stuff. Don't be afraid to launch it, and that will give you insight in itself. You can then start going out and doing those interviews if you do have to rush it out, and say, what's working for you, what's not working for you. A great opportunity there is to do user profiling. I think as an L&D team, we don't do that enough either. Even from whether that's specifically e-learning solutions or whether it's technology, we're very good at assuming we know what people want. And yes, we are L&D professionals and we know the trends and what works well in learning theory, but there's still a lot of assumptions that we're making there. So team leaders are always the one that comes to mind, in that we know that they're very time poor people and that their time is of the essence for them because they get pulled in so many different directions. 50% of their job is probably not actually their job, but dealing with other rubbish that people throw at them. So it's a horrible job. I've been in that job. I would never go back. I really wouldn't. So if you spend the time to profile that team leader, you're going to get things. Essentially, what you want in a user profile, for people that aren't familiar with the term, is essentially you create a picture or a story about those people, and you have on there. You make it real. You give them the real name, their job title, and a bio. Then you've got on there their responsibilities, and then you start really getting down into what are their needs. So it might be things like time, constant support, whatever it might be. What are their needs of that particular person? What are their goals? What are they trying to achieve? And then what are their frustrations or challenges? And if you gain that insight, what that basically tells you is if you find that their frustrations and challenges are always being asked to go on a 2-hour e-learning course because in the key needs they are very time poor, don't keep trying to put them on to a 2-hour workshop and wonder why they don't turn up. Find a solution that works for them. And that's when you get into the realms of, well, maybe a one-shoe-fits-all solution doesn't work for everybody, but actually the team managers need 5 or 6 resources that they can do here and there, and maybe a quiz at the end. And then your people that you can physically book time off for, you create that 2-hour workshop or an e-learning course or an e-learning plus resource, whatever that solution might look like. Don't get into the realms of thinking that that's the right solution, that's the best way to go, and everyone needs to work around that way of learning. And I guess that's the same thing with when you start looking at the LXPs as well. Don't assume that everybody wants or categorises everything in the same way. So as a first dashboard, what does a team leader need versus a shop floor person versus senior leadership versus HR versus L&D? But all these different roles have different needs and different frustrations and different challenges. To build that around them, it's not like these platforms and this tech doesn't have the ability to create different dashboards for different people. So to build it there, if a team leader needs insight into what their people have and haven't done, or whether they are on track on a learning plan, give that to them. Don't think that I want to give them this great new visual that says all this new stuff that's coming up and here's all of your learning plan stuff. If that's not what's important to them, don't put it on there. And that user profiling is a great way of just having it in the background and just saying, in anything you do, let's consider the people. And that's where you get this empathy mapping. I know that's one of your favourite terms, or user-led design and all this stuff that we throw around. But that's the starting point. It's nothing new. This is everything that the product design world does. But they do all of this before they build the product. They don't build a product and then try and reverse it. So where you can, do all of this user profiling, journey mapping, and interviews and insight stuff up front, and then build a product around that. But then don't stagnate it, keep learning from it, keep developing.
Well, we really are going for a homey feel with some of the edits I'm having to do in this episode. I'm not sure what's happening with internet in Swindon, but we both seem to be having some interesting issues today. So I guess one thing that was striking me before that impromptu, we'll call it an ad break without an ad. There we go. It's I'll insert some kind of funky L&D ad right here.
You just needed another drink, really.
No one is supposed to know. Anyway, one thing that really struck me before that was a lot of this stuff I think is very, very doable when you're bringing in a new platform or a new approach, or if if you're a new L&D manager coming in and you're shaking things up. But quite often we're in a place where there is a substantial backlog of content on the platform that people have access to, or we have bought a big library that's great value and whatever it might be, and we're going to implement it, but it is a huge amount of content. I mean, some of the, we've both kind of seen them. Some of these libraries are kind of untold masses of courses and resources and images and campaign stuff. What do you do as an L&D person having that kind of, for want of a better term, dumped on you, make use of it? Where do you even start in that kind of situation?
So I always start with any problem as to what you're trying to achieve, what's the purpose and what's the goal of this stuff. And not necessarily the long-term goal, but what's the specific goals you need to be fixing here and now. Because although there's all this great stuff that we talked about user experience, but ultimately a good user experience is still ultimately solving a problem of the end user or the end person who's delivering whatever solution that might be to. And like you said, all of this stuff is great stuff, and there are limitations to what we can do here. Because at the end of the day, you can't go back to your LXP provider or content provider and say, well, our people need X specific things, change all of this just for us. That's never going to happen unless you fund a completely new bespoke platform for yourself. So There are certainly limitations, so I'm not by no way advocating that you have to go out and completely make your bespoke platform and technology and stuff. But how do you best utilize all of that stuff to create the best experience possible and solve the end user's needs and goals as best as possible? So for me, if we just brought in a load of content and we've already got a platform in place, the first thing I would do would be, as a team, let's card sort it. So how do we think all of this needs to kind of sit together? What's a specific learning plan? What falls into leadership, into communication, into health and safety, whatever that might look like. Maybe it's core competencies in your business and you're building it around a competency framework. Do that exercise and sort all it out. I'm talking literally old school, maybe not post-it notes because that's not very environmentally friendly, but that's how it used to be done. There's great software out there that can help you in this process and do it collaboratively, like Miro. I found Miro recently, and that is a great tool. I'll tell you that. It's basically an online post-it note tool. Is all I use it for, but it's brilliant because I'm not using all of these things that sit on my desk, but I'm actually thinking of the planet while I do a lot of brain dumping. But if you do all of that card sorting, and then what you then do is get people to do the exact same thing. Your end users, get them involved and say, here's all the content. How would you organise it? How would you categorise it based on what you want to achieve? Now, again, as we said earlier, that's not to say that that's what's going to happen. It's just giving you insight into your the people that you're delivering this product for. So they might categorise it completely different. Now, if everybody categorises it different and everybody puts X particular course into X category, then you'd be bonkers not to do that. If one individual person does that, but everybody else does otherwise, then you don't do that. You find the trends, but this is where, again, delivering for people, not to people, becomes a big help. If you have to do it quick, because I know that happens, I would at least organise stuff into some logical order, into collections, learning plans, catalogue, whatever that might be, terminology, but then get the feedback from people. Do all of that stuff that we talked about earlier on about interviewing them, gaining that insight, sending out those surveys, and just tweak and change as you go. I think the worst thing that you can do, and L&D often doesn't get a chance to do it properly, whether that's a specific learning solution or anything you do, is actually do a thorough analysis of what you put out to business. And that's not because we don't want to, it's because we're getting so pushed to move on to the next problem and move on to the next problem, we never get a chance to sit back and do it. So, it will always have these limitations, we'll always have these challenges, but it's how you present those challenges or the need to do this stuff to your stakeholders. I guess the most powerful way of doing it is if somebody can't or doesn't know how to access the content, then we have nothing. We've just wasted all this money on a platform that nobody can use. It's an odd thing, but it's a learning curve. It is a learning curve. And it's just about start those conversations. What's the worst they're going to say? No. And then all you do is, why do they say no? You objection handle like anybody else, any other business does. So also get used to not only speaking kind of to your people. We're great people. We know how to talk about engagement and learners and talk about the worldly dreams to kind of to our audience and specific stakeholders. We're not always very good at how do we adjust that messaging to speak to stakeholders and get them to see the value in doing this particular activity, and that we do need 2, 3, 4 months of building it, testing it, revamping it, and then launching it, not just buying it and putting it out there straight away. Because often the argument to that is, well, can't you do that whilst it's out there? And there is that argument, but it takes longer for people, I've found anyway in my experience, I don't know whether there's any scientific proof out there, it takes longer to try and change people's opinions and how they use a particular product than it does to just launch it straight away and build up on that knowledge. So
well, yeah, I mean, it's the same as the kind of existing learning principle, isn't it? That getting people to learn a new way of doing something or unlearn the wrong way of doing something is much more difficult than taking someone who has no idea and telling them for the first time how to do it and how to do it right.
Exactly.
It's exactly the same thing. Really.
Yeah, and it's perceptions as well. I know we've seen it, and we've been through that struggle ourselves, haven't we? Of seeing a platform being launched with, let's say, 10 resources on it, and people it gets a bad rap. And people go, well, what's the point in it? Or I can't use it. The experience of that was horrendous. And trying to find what you're actually looking for with the search, because the search system wasn't built yet, was horrible. So you couldn't actually find anything you need. So it got this really bad rap, and it was down to our team, the L&D team, wasn't it, us, to try and change these mindsets and change these perceptions, basically through churn of employees. That's the only way it got adopted, was churn of employees, and it being part of their day one, not this product that existing staff go, well, it's useless, because it's really hard to change a perception of a bad product. iPhone is a great example, in Apple products, aren't they? Somebody uses an Apple product and can't get on with it, they'll say they don't like it. Somebody who's used an Apple product for a long period of time, that's a very different insight onto it. And that's where you kind of get this divide of Apple, don't you? As to whether you like or don't like it. It's either people have made that sudden judgment and they'll never try it again. It's the best product in the world now. They're never going to try it again because they've got that perception.
And then there are those of us that are just correct and say that they're a terrible company and you shouldn't give them the money.
Well, that's a different debate. I'm not advocating Apple, by the way. It's just the example that comes out there. While we're on that...
No, absolutely. Apple are an interesting example. They invest a vast amount of time and money finding out what people think about them. And it almost looks like a vanity exercise until you realise there is a reason that they generate the sales that they generate. There is a reason that they launch the same product repeatedly with minute changes between generations, and yet everyone drops everything and buys it the day it comes out and queue up outside their own specialist shops. There is something in that backwards and forwards communication with your user and knowing what your users actually need rather than trying to guess.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess we always moan about it, don't we? About Adobe, Photoshop, and all their products have different interfaces. Well, a similar interface, but it's all different language, and the same way of doing one particular thing is different on different software. But there's a reason for it. They've not just done it to be a painful pain in the backside. They've done it because they've spoken to their end users and they understand their end language. I'm using Photoshop, and realistically I've got no reason to be using Photoshop. All I'm trying to do is cut out the background and put a colour behind it. The product wasn't designed for me. It's not solving my problems. It's solving photographers and graphic designers' problems. Whereas something like Illustrator, that does speak to me. I understand the language and I find that absolutely beautiful to work with, but other people won't, because what their challenges are, and the product wasn't built for them. So it's the same principle. And just because you've done it one way in one business doesn't mean it will work in another. I've seen great online platforms. There was an outsourcing partner that I used to work for that had it was called I won't drop the name, it was called a company name University, and it was wonderful. And it wasn't revolutionary, it wasn't necessarily the best content, but it was easy to use, it was easy to navigate, easy to sign up for online webinars and track your completion and all of that stuff. And we're talking 10 years ago that this was in place. That wouldn't work necessarily in other businesses that I've worked for, because they have more needs. This was a global company, global outsourcing company. Basically, their goal of their people was everybody needs to be able to do everything in the same way, regardless of your experience and whatever it might be. It was this is the way that we do this, and our policies and processes. So let's teach you that. But there was still a degree of open catalogue if you wanted to self-develop it into other areas. It was they basically said, we're an outsourced partner with limited opportunities in the business, so let's not slam a load of learning on there. Let's just keep people what they need to be able to do these different jobs. So that worked really well.
And I think that's something that's overlooked. You see a lot now on LinkedIn, the internet, anywhere you go. What makes an amazing platform? Is it, AR compatibility? Is it XAPI? Is it, the option to have campaigns and all this kind of stuff? And my response is always the same. The best, from a learning perspective, the best platforms are the ones with a simple and easy to use interface. That's it. That's what makes a great platform to me. I actually don't care, as an end user, I don't care whether it supports AR or VR. I don't care whether it supports XAPI or SCORM. I don't care whether or not the campaign email integration works with MailChimp. I care about how quickly can I get to the thing that I'm here to do, and how quickly can I do it and get out of it. That's the kind of harsh truth of how people interact with learning platforms in a workplace. Because usually you've been given 15 minutes to do a 15-minute course, including getting to the platform, navigating the platform, finding the course, launching the course, completing the course.
The end user goal is to find and complete a learning course, or to find and upload the content they want to if you're doing user-generated content.
Yeah.
So how do you make that simple? And there are some great interfaces out there, but it's very easy to undo all of that great work by cataloguing all of your content in completely the wrong way, or just dumping it all into one place, or maybe even making it too limited. Learning paths are a great example of that, and using all the functionality that is built into these existing platforms and technologies, using them in the right way. So notifications, if we talk about notifications to begin with, usually you can notify in the LMS, you can email, you can usually text, you can usually email team leader, whatever it might be. So you've got all these different options. That's not to say that any one of these or all of them are the right thing to do. What will work for your people? Because there's no point emailing the team leader because that's what you think is the best thing to do, because then they can have a word with your staff as to why they've not done it. If they get 200 emails every day, it's the wrong experience. It's not effective.
Yeah.
So maybe the right thing is to notify the individual, but it's how do you do that? And that's where things like tagging things, like compulsory learning, let's say, or something that's kind of needed now, to the top. So it becomes even quicker for people to find and access it. Don't leave them to try and find it and search it and reference back to the email. What was the course called that you want me to do? Let's find it on there. Which catalogue was it in? Pin it to the top of their dashboard. 2 clicks. Even if you've got a single sign-on, it's actually no clicks. I'm on. Let's click it. I'm into the course. That's where we're talking about utilising these existing features to create better experiences. So figure out what works well for your business. And run with that. Don't think that just because somebody else is doing it, or because you can do something, you have to do that.
Yeah, it's interesting actually. I shared an article today, actually, weirdly, this is odd, about not chasing squirrels, of all things. And the idea being that there's always a new technology coming out, right? There's always something coming along that's going to revolutionise the industry. The same things that we said that we're going to do it like 5 years ago, and we're still here. It's largely doing the same things. And the thing that struck me after I was talking to a few people about it, and I realised that probably the longest standing and popular learning platform remains YouTube. Despite all the YouTube killers like TikTok and Instagram and all these things that have come along to kind of take that away, and yet YouTube has just kind of sat there. And it's not really revolutionised its interface or its approach. It's very simple. The videos that are most relevant to you appear when you open it, based on everything you've looked at before. You can subscribe to things, and we can organise videos either as just general videos or in playlists. And you kind of think, year after year, it is voted the best online learning tool by quite some margin. The next thing below that is Google. Nowhere in that top 10 list is ever an LMS. or any online education provider. Heck, you got LinkedIn, TikTok comes up before you get to the likes of Coursera and edX and things like that. So you really have to wonder, especially when you start talking about broader user experience, product design, and going way back to the start, the idea of L&D being a whole product solution. We're not trying to invent anything new here. This has been done by other businesses for a very long time. It just seems to be us that kind of aren't doing it, basically.
Yeah, I think this is where those kind of terminologies come in, all these, I guess, fads almost about, how do you use TikTok as a learning experience, or let's be the Netflix of learning. To me, anyway, when somebody says that, what that says to me is actually what you're trying to achieve is a better experience, not that it needs to be all learning content, video content, or that people need to be able to do funny dances and whatever it might be that people do on TikTok. I've never used it. But it's about those experiences and the platforms. That's really what we're saying. How do we replicate that success in accessing and consuming content? Let's face it, we're never going to be as good as them because people are limited. Nobody's ever going to sit there and stream until 11 o'clock at night, compliance learning. No, they're not. They will do it with Game of Thrones or whatever series is currently on Prime, Netflix, whatever it might be. It's a different type of consuming content. So that's where we need to break that line, in that we are never going to be able to be those platforms or as engaging and successful in that people just want to stay on them for hours. And what we can do is learn from them and say, well, why are they successful? And does that work for our people as well? We don't do enough research. Maybe we don't do enough research out there when we're doing all this. I've spoken a lot about speaking to your people and finding out what they need and mapping your own processes. But do look out externally at what other people are doing and what makes stuff successful. It's the first thing I do when I'm designing a website. Is what are competitor websites doing? How do they lay it out? How are they ordering their content? And it's not because I'm copying them or cheating. It's just saying, well, if they're successful in doing what they do, let's learn from that. It's just a different type of research.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do it in every other element, right? I don't think anyone would claim that when they're designing content, they've never taken inspiration from someone else's work.
No, absolutely
or
not.
A famous film or an app that they like or anything like that. That's the core of every creative process, whether it's L&D, classical art, TV, everything's a repeat of something else at the end of the day. And yet I guess there's that hesitance of, we want to be totally new and groundbreaking, but actually you can do that with, Netflix is Blockbuster on the internet.
Yeah.
It wasn't a new idea when they came along. Blockbuster must have been furious when they came along and went, hang on a minute, that's our business model. They've just put it on a website rather than in a store. Turns out that was a good way to go.
Yeah.
But ultimately, that's what it was. It wasn't a new idea, it was an evolution of an idea. And I think what we're talking about here really is that. It's not throw everything out and start again. It is, like I said, review where you are, take that next step, consider your people a bit more. So I guess from yourself then, over, I think we've been going for a while actually, haven't we?
Yeah.
So I'll get towards rounding up. But I'm always really interested to hear from people at the moment. Over the next kind of 12 months, what's the big focus for you in your current role, in your career? What does the next year look like?
So specifically for me, that's about how do we better support and work with customers once they buy our product. How do we support and help them in basically all of this stuff that we've been talking about? They're buying a library with a lot of courses. How do we onboard them better so that they understand all the capabilities of the platform and the content? How do we work with them and support them in setting this all right up for success for their world, not a generic world? So really, that's what's kind of on the cards for me for the next 12 months. Basically, doing everything we've done here and working with clients to do that. I lost you.
Awesome. I think it's oh, I've lost you this time as well. Can you hear me?
Yep. There was a bit of a lag, but I can hear you now.
Cool. I have got a message. Video has been disabled due to internet quality issues. Their video is still recording. Cool, you're fine. I like this platform. At least it's saving the recording locally. That's good. Cool. I'll just pick up from there. Yeah, so that sounds like a busy next 12 months, which is never a bad thing, right? That's the day we're not busy is the day we're in trouble, I always think. And I feel like it's the journey that a lot of, and obviously I am, especially as a content provider to businesses and a library provider, but even internal teams, I think, need to be looking at that journey and thinking about where they are on it. Because there's really very little difference between the two in terms of the core things, what's important to people. So that sounds really awesome. It'd be great to have you back in series 3 maybe to hear about how that's gone in 7 years' time when I get around to actually recording it. Be dropped back in. But just as a closing thought, I mean, same time frame over the next 12 months. What are you looking for in the broader L&D kind of world? What are you excited about or not excited about?
I mean, I'm excited that people are now almost the hand has been forced to say what they offer in their people. Which I think a lot of people are excited about anyway. I guess my biggest hope for the next 12 months is that people drop these hard and fast rules about what is the right way to do something and shift more to here's a whole tool and an arsenal of different approaches. Which of these is the best to use at the most appropriate time to solve the specific goal? So I hope that's my biggest hope for the next 12 months is that we don't say a hard and fast rule that X way is the right way to do it, but actually say that's a great way to do it for this particular issue, and not necessarily for everybody, but that person over there needs this, that person over here needs that. And that's, I think, where we'll enable and empower people to really thrive and grow in their roles by listening to them and creating what they need, not what we want.
Awesome. Well, Phill, thank you so much for taking the time to come back on the show after so long. It's been a real pleasure having a chat.
No problem. It's been interesting because my light's obviously slowly going out as it gets darker here, so because I'm in the conservatory, which is the office, and a storm has been coming over as we've been talking, so it's been gradually getting darker and darker as we've gone through.
Well, there we are. Engagement challenge, viewers. If you're watching the video, let's see how good Tom's editing skills are. Can you hear the storm? Can you hear Phill? Is it too dark to even see Phill by the end of the episode? Thanks again for tuning in and listening. Appreciate every single one of you taking the time to listen to really just the ramblings of me chatting to people in the industry, though they tend to be more interesting than I. If you've really enjoyed what you've heard, please do hit the like button and consider subscribing to the channel. If you really love what you've seen and heard, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. You can do so for as little as £1 a month, and that supports everything we do here on the channel and allows us to run our IDTX events twice a year,